Hello, my name is Hugh Patterson, and I am presenting today at the 8th International Conference on Language Documentation and Conservation. The title of my talk is Supporting Diversity Through a Typology of Data Providers. What is an archive? And this is the central question. What is the archive? And first, I'll take a look through some different ways that linguists have used the term archive in literature, and then talk about a typology that I'm proposing for the open language archives community to help people identify the kind of data provider. So let's take a look. My work here has been inspired a bit by some analysis that came out in a paper by Yi and others. And the title of that paper was Accessibility, Discoverability, and Functionality, an Audit of and Recommendations for Digital Language Archives. And so here's a critical question. What do we mean by the term archives? And this may seem a bit straightforward, but for some of us, the concept of archive is seated in a concept of the institution. That is, an institution with specific mandates and responsibilities and management that preserve the contents of that institution as a steward for a variety of stakeholders. In information science and the area of scholarship around those preservation activities and the management of those institutions, the term archive has a very different meaning. An archive is a set or collection of, they call them records, and they're usually from a single institution. They're usually from a company or corporation of some kind. And a record is like a file in that sense. It's a set of material that is then part of a grouping, a set. And inside of these sets, there's usually a very specific kind of order. Maybe it's chronological order, or maybe it's a topical order, or maybe it's a set of materials from a couple of different offices in that organization. And maybe each office's materials are, a subset together. So an archive then, in our parlance, is sometimes referring to an institution and sometimes to a unit of materials. Let's take a look, when we look at the web, then, how these two different understandings of the term correlate to websites, right? So on the left here, we have a picture of the front page of ILA, the Archive of Indigenous Languages of Latin America. And on the right, we have the Digital Archive of Scottish Gaelic. If we assume that these two websites are to, in some way, bring us the same type of interactivity around those resources, we might be missing the purpose for which those websites exist. The one on the left, the ILO's website, it is an introduction to a way to explore the many different preservation artifacts that exist in its stewardship. While the one on the right, the Digital Archive of Scottish Gaelic, is actually something linguists might more or less call a corpus. In this is a particular set of Scottish Gaelic materials, records, that have been connected in particular ways so that scholars can engage with the wide variety of resources. So one is a stewardship, the front page to a stewardship organization, and the other is to a extractable resource that can help scholars create new resources. So there's two very different levels here of, quote, archives, and two very different concepts that are trying to be brought to the web. Another example, if we take a general understanding of a set of resources and label that archive, in contrast to the Scottish Gaelic, we might say, Michael Allen's collection of indigenous texts from California would constitute an archive. And there's no reason to really think that maybe it wouldn't. It's not necessarily a corpus in that all the texts are queryable to the same degree, but each text stands independently. So each record, and there is an organizational structure to those records. Sometimes we might think of an archive in our popular parlance today in our popular speech to think, oh, there's a website out there, I can put a preprint up and that's archived. And a lot of our archives work even at the institutional level for digital libraries. Maybe we can think of Paradisic or Aida Kalipulahone in Hawaii, and there's a large variety of these resources, Pangloss. So when we think about these, do we think of them in the same way as a document server? So, individual files stored, or do we think of them in terms of units of resources, right? So the archival bond is the connection that those particular files would have together. So we can say, a site like Cogprints, which was a preprint server from a couple of years ago, it's since been itself archived. It's been taken offline, but the material can still be accessed and through a digital libraries interface. It's not exactly indexed by Google anymore. Archive.org is accessible, but these are both represented distribution platforms, repository platforms that were able to provide access to resources on the file basis. And the intrinsic unit was just the single record, the file. It wasn't even connected to anything else necessarily. And in contrast to that, this is a picture of the Japanese Language and Literature Journal on JSTOR. And we can see here that the journal had several different iterations in its name, and those records are related and connected. And then the various issues, and eventually, even if you drill down, the articles are available and connected in very specific ways related to these particular resources. So the archival bond in the presentation of the journal is very specific. Looking more broadly, though, like how is this really an issue in our scholarly communications? I think it is, not just in the way that Yi et al. Presented archives as evaluating their web interfaces and taking different types together, but then we talk about, we use the same terminology in our scholarly communications to mean different things. So it is, I think, a broader issue of confusion. So if we look at Ranter and McWeeny, I use Google Scholar to just kind of bring out some of the highlights of these articles. So they're talking about Child Language Data Exchange System archive. And so for them, it's a project. Archive is this project-based collection of data, of records and their relationship to each other, and they have it in an extractable format. So maybe this sounds a little bit more like a corpus. But maybe we could, in that sense, then, like this corpus kind of thing, the right-hand side in the previous slides, the Indian Sepoy experience in Europe from 1914, 1918, archive, language, and feeling. So Das is writing, and it goes beyond official archives, that in Hindi, in small archives, in I'm not going to say this well, but Chandramangora, in this sense, he's using the archives as these bundles of resources. The issue in creating a digital archive of signed language, right? So Johnson and colleagues are writing about some great work that they've done with sign language resources. And so there they talk about the archive, but I'm fairly certain that what they mean is some set of resources that has a coherence together, rather than some institutional provider of longevity. So when we come down and we talk about Wasson and Holton, and they say one of the challenges facing language archives is the fact that, and they go on, they're talking about user experience design for language archives interfaces. What is a language archive? Is it the interface to a institutional service provider that engages with people, that preserves resources, or is it a set of resources and they're associated, those resources' relationships to each other that were often in the case as scholar put together in the case in the course of scholarly work. Real world language usage, looking again at some other terms, the archives. So here, Franchetto is writing an international researchers institution hosted in the archives to future generations. In this sense, it seems that they're talking more about the institutional side of things, right? So things that like Isla that were on the right-hand side or left-hand side of the previous slides. So this leaves some like open questions then. Like if we look at Simons and Bird, and they're talking about the open language archive community, the archives community. So are they talking about, bundles of resources or that have the relationships of those internal components well defined? Or are they talking about institutions? Maybe they're talking about both. And they've taken in Fauconnier and Fillmore's kind of concept of frames, and they've taken two separate frames and brought them together. I think pulling these apart gives us a perspective into diversity of what types of records are generated about language resources and what kinds of web interfaces exist and why they exist. And that gives us some grounding when we go to do evaluations. So archiving as a ing based verb here, right, becomes then this relationship that scholars have to preservation organizations. Trends in archiving, language resource archiving, and in scholars that deal with preservation institutions, we would call this accessioning. But there is, if we have these two, what do we mean, right? If we have these two definitions of archive, maybe what some of these people are saying by the term archiving is the fact of building the set and that collection together. It's hard to say. So I want to also address two misconceptions that I've seen in a variety of places. But I think there's literature to support these, and I'll tie them in a few minutes here. So access does not equal archiving, right? So just because something's on the web doesn't mean that it's archived, right? And so Fiera writes and colleagues write about this in 2001 and a great follow-up article in 2021 and 2022, follow-up article in 2022. And they talk about how web presentations still need to have their content archived, referring to the institutional preservation, preserving them in institutional capacities. And then the second one is that the website of an institution is not necessarily the place of the archive. So the website isn't the archive. That there is some sort of management and data management facility behind that is managed along with the website by the institution. These are the front facing, customer facing, client facing resource is not necessarily the data management resource. And we can see some evidence of this in some of the things that are written. So Zaiton writing about the Taiwanese, the Formosan language archive in Taiwan. The display of the archive will not be, meaning that there's this concept that's different. So you have the display and then you have the archive, right? And then you have Hildebrandt, who's writing with colleagues and says, the archives and web exhibits. So we have, the bundles of resources and you have their web exhibits, meaning that these two things are going to need to be managed independently, at least inferencing that. So where did this common frame come from? And how can we help people understand more about the providers of information, the resource providers that commonly get called language archives? Well, OLAC's current definition of a data provider can only have two possibilities. And so tacitly, my, or maybe even overtly now, my recommendation is that we take a look at this and think about diversity and think how diversity could help us understand data providers more clearly, more succinctly. The two types here are institutional and personal. So either you're part of an organization or you're just on your own. And I think some of these concepts don't actually help us understand how resources are being managed well. So let's take a look at some of these resource categories that I've extracted and proposing. So basically, it's three broad categories: access institution, exhibits, standalone collections, and reference resources. In terms of classes of data providers and access institutions, we have some resource providers that are archives, and they're focused on preservation, curation, and community re-engagement of resources. We have some that are repositories. They're faithful to the distribution of the content that they were given. They don't change the content in, content out. Libraries, in contrast to these two, are more in tune with temporal communal access. So whatever the community needs now, let's get them access to that. And through time, that might change. The actual resources might change. Museums are different in their funding models. They may be temporal communal access. They may be more like an archive with preservation access, but their funding model and is different. Usually it's related to governments, but not always. Then there's a gallery, which is explicitly focused on sales. The business model for each of these types of institutions radically impacts the kinds of records they maintain about the resources they steward. So when we think about websites and how these types of institutions engage with their constituencies, that's going to impact the communication pieces that websites are. We have additionally, though, the need to look at special collections. They're limited in scope by topic or experience. Personal CV or portfolios linked to a single person's work. A lab or a department portfolio is a group of people. And this may be part of an institution, or some individuals might put together a resource together collaboratively without an official organization. And a project portfolio is on a specific project, right? Reference resources are, I think I've found, and I'm open to comments and suggestions here, well, in any of the typology that I'm presenting here, but typological databases cover a variety of languages and have a unique topical focus. Whereas bibliographies have focused generally on a single language or a single topic. Typology databases are often interactive in a particular way that's different from bibliographies. So in the OLAC sense then, or even in our scholarly communication sense, is everything an archive? Or do we have a need for a vocabulary that distinguishes these things? And by acknowledging this sort of diversity, do we actually help our community understand maintenance and record keeping of resources? So bibliographies are less likely to actually have the resources available when you go to a web interface to engage with them. Whereas an archive, I'm suggesting the institutional archive, it actually would have the resources available for access. I mean, it might be gated or mediated access, but there would be a resource behind the listing. If we look at the OLAC data providers currently, we can see that there's a lot of data providers. And these data providers span the entire range of this typology. And so as such, we should look and say, oh, well, we have a lot of institutions in the green area that are participating in OLAC. Maybe there's a room for expansion in the blue area. Maybe there's more room for expansion in the pink area, even though there's a significant number of typological databases that are actually data providers to OLAC. So this is just to say that I think we can see evidence of this typology at work, and that understanding it and drawing these things out would increase the applicability of our source data providers for helping us understand where language resources are currently and how they're being stewarded. So by recognizing the diversity in data providers, it allows us to form interaction and quality-based expectations around web interactions. Thank you, and I anticipate your questions.